Welcome, everyone. I don't know what it's doing where you are, but I'm getting a rain snow mix here in Greenville, Michigan. So I hope your weather's better where you are. Thank you for joining us tonight. Tonight, we're being joined by Melanie Mannion, who's with the Ottawa County Parks Department. She's their Natural Resources Manager. Melanie has a BS in biology and environmental science and an MS in conservation biology from Central Michigan University. Go Chips. Before her current career, Melanie worked for the Land Conservancy of West Michigan and Blandford Nature Center. Melanie started working for Ottawa County Parks in 2011 and is responsible for coordinating the protection, stewardship, and restoration of natural resources on park properties and for the development of comprehensive park volunteer programs. Melanie founded the West Michigan Conservation Network, currently heading up the Public and Partner Learning and Engagement Committee. Melanie is all about education, and as she has generously provided presentations to Wild Winds River City, Kent MSU Master Gardeners, Montcalm area Master Gardeners, to name a few over the past 11 years. She's been an instructor for the MSU Master Naturalist program. As our dear friend Jenny Wani says, Melanie just lives and breathes collaboration, and I couldn't agree more.
Oh, thank you.
Welcome, Melanie.
Well, thank you very much for letting me come and talk about one of my favorite subjects. I absolutely love being able to talk about oak savannas. So let me share my screen quickly. Can you see my screen? Yep. Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Great. My computer is acting a little slow this night. I think it's ready for bed already. Come on. Let's try that again. Oh my goodness. It was there during practice. Why is it not going now? Let's see. Oh, there we go. Maybe it'll work now. So I'm going to talk about oak savannas in Michigan. So I'm going to start off a little bit with the definition of what an oak savanna is, and then some of the different species that you would find in an oak savanna, and then the restoration of an oak savanna, because at this point in Michigan, it is 100% almost always a restoration process. So this beautiful photo, which so many of us would love to be walking down that trail, is not in Michigan. We really don't have places like this in Michigan because so many of our oak savannas have been destroyed. And we're going to talk about the reasons for that and how many in just a little bit. But this picture is out of Chicago, and they are probably about 20 to 30 years ahead of us in restoration. And one of the reasons why is because they had remnant oak savannas that they didn't want to lose. And so you can go to Chicago area. You can actually go into Chicago and find beautiful places like this. And it's
Melanie,
because they recognize, yes.
Excuse me, can you make we're seeing your whole screen. And that's the slideshow. Can you make that go full screen?
Yes, I can definitely try to do that. Where did my full screen go? So you're saying you could see the all of you?
Yeah.
Oh,
yes. And I can see your toolbar and everything.
Oh, well, that shouldn't be. Is that a full? Oh, goodness. Let's see. Well, I am not sure. Do you know how to do that? Because I thought I had it in full screen. Let's try it again. You know what? Do you mind if I try it from the beginning?
No, go ahead and restart it.
Let's try that one more time. And see, it did it again. This is exactly, oh my goodness gracious. This is exactly what it was doing earlier to me. Well, I apologize. Okay.
It's not a big deal.
Well, it's definitely frustrating, but as we were saying earlier, it's been the day of frustrations for this technology. And how many years are we into this? How about that? Is that better?
Yes, but it's still small.
It's still small. It's
I
a
can't,
full screen on mine.
hmm,
That is really strange. Let me show
maybe
presenter.
it's how I have my view set up.
How's that?
I think your screen looks okay to me.
Does it
Okay,
look okay? Okay. Well, let me know if it changes. Hopefully this is okay, but you can see, you should be seeing this, the screen of the flowers.
yep, Martha says it looks good. Thank you, Martha.
Okay, great. Thank you. Again, tonight is the night of technology problems. Okay. So again, much of what we have in Michigan really is just our restoration, but there are not many remnants left. But we do know that this was a very common ecosystem when the settlers first came. And if you haven't gone through some of the old GLOs, these are these notes that the surveyors that were first here before the settlers came, they came and they surveyed all of Michigan, and they took these detailed notes of what species were there and the characteristics of the area. And you can go and you can find your exact spot in Michigan and read these beautiful, very flowery descriptions of what was there, including the size of the trees and the different flowers that were made up in the area. And so this is one of my favorite quotes that it was said by Ruth Happen. And if you don't know who Ruth Happen is, definitely research her. She's a fascinating person who was a naturalist, a botanist, and she was a professor at what is now Eastern Michigan University, and just an amazing woman ahead of her time. And she, when asked about how she would describe oak savannas, this is what she said. She said, describe the appearance of a Michigan oak openings in its primeval beauty. Such a description would require the eye of an artist and the pen of a poet, surpassing in beautiful effects the most skillful landscape gardening and city park scenery. So for those of you, all of you are gardeners. So I think you would really appreciate that what she saw when she looked at an oak savanna was a big, lush, beautiful garden that was just natural. It didn't need to be planted. It was just there. Now, scientists will tell you that there is a range of oak savannas, and they fall between a prairie, which has little to no trees in it, to an oak forest. But everything in the middle is what we consider an oak savanna. And it's all based on the plant species that are there, the soil types that are there, but they're all fire dependent, each one of these. And we'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. But really, the way you know you have an oak savanna is by looking at the unique flora and fauna that are in the site. And these are some of the most beautiful places you can imagine going to because of these unique flora and fauna that live in them and make it their habitat. So, of course, one of them that is the most beloved of all are butterflies, including the monarch caterpillar. But most butterflies are actually dependent on these savanna species, these savannas. They've been able to adapt to our yards and our neighborhoods oftentimes, but they need these flowers that require sunlight. And so many, if not most of our butterflies are going to be found in the savanna complex is what we call it. So here is our monarch feeding on a typical oak savanna species, which is our butterfly weed, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. One of my personal favorites is a shrub called pasture rose or prairie rose. This is a lovely, lovely native rose that feeds many different insects, but when it has its flowers, it is just a graceful flower addition to any garden. I have many different native roses within my own landscape, and it's just fantastic to watch all the different pollinators that use these roses when they're in bloom. And I don't know if I'm just crazy, but it seems like there's a bloom on these all summer long. I feel like anytime I'm out, there's at least one flower out there. They're just prolific. And of course, one of everyone's favorites and one of the most popular is the lupin. And lupin is a fantastic species, has a fantastic story to it because it comes from the word lupus, which many of you may know means it's the scientific name for wolf. And so when they named lupin, they named it after a wolf because it grew in areas that was very poor in nutrients. And so they thought that lupin was actually stealing the nutrients out of the soil, like the wolves were stealing their livestock. When in fact, if you know anything about lupin, it's actually a nitrogen fixator, and it makes nitrogen and it actually puts nutrients into the soil. So it is a complete misnomer, and it was given a bad rap for so many years. But now finally it has been able to get its true glory of being one of the most important plants in our state, because we now know that it is critical to protecting this very rare species, our most well-known oak savanna species, and that is our Karner blue butterfly. The Karner blue butterfly is federally endangered in most parts of the country, which is a very small, it's in the Midwest. It is in steep decline, and it's been extirpated in several states. Michigan has often been the stronghold for this species, but even here it's vulnerable to many of the things we're going to talk about today. I know a lot of people, a lot of people who want to protect this species. And I often get really passionate about this. I used to, when I was at the Land Conservancy, manage several preserves that had Karner blue butterflies. And I actually did the research, and it turns out that these students are often learning about endangered species in their classrooms, and they're learning about cheetahs out in Africa, but Karner blue are on the same trajectory as cheetahs. So when we talk about these rare species that might disappear from the earth, this is one that's in many of our backyards that we could actually do something about. We can help cheetah rescue, but this is one you can actually get your hands dirty and get out on your hands and knees and protect the habitat for this wonderful rare butterfly. But I always say this with caution because there are several other butterflies that look very similar to this, including the spring azure and the summer azure. And oftentimes people, when they see a spring azure or a summer azure, say, I have a Karner blue butterfly, or they will plant lupin just hoping that a Karner blue will come to their yard. Karner blue are extremely rare, which is why they're federally protected. So if you have a butterfly in your yard, it is most likely not a Karner blue butterfly. However, if you are in a location like Montcalm or Kent County, or especially Newaygo or Allegan County, you could have this. And there are many people that I know that accidentally discovered that they had this federally endangered species on their property, and then now managing their properties to make sure that they keep this species on our planet. So this is just one, we call this a flagship species, meaning we talk a lot about and get people really excited so that they can protect the habitat for this Karner blue. But really what we're doing is protecting the habitat for all these different unique species that live in oak savannas, including this adorable little guy, our box turtle. So many of our turtle species, like this box turtle, are in steep decline. And you may be one of those people that say, oh, I see box turtles all the time. And it is true. You can, especially if you live in an area with an oak forest and an oak savanna, you might see box turtles frequently. But the real key to it is knowing if your box turtles are reproducing. These are turtles that can live around 80 years old. So your turtle may be there, but is really a relic of the past and isn't reproducing. So if you see a box turtle and it's 10 years and younger, get excited. That's what you should be getting excited about, because that means you have a viable box turtle habitat or population. But seeing a turtle that might, and you know by counting those rings, just like you count a tree, if you look at those scales on there and you can see all those different rings, if you count those and they have 30 or 40 or 50, you have a 50-year-old turtle. And that isn't necessarily something to celebrate unless you know that you're doing the good work to make sure that their habitat is good and is going to continue to be viable for them to reproduce. Another important thing, if you want box turtles, one thing scientists always struggle with, including myself, is these are fire dependent species. They need these oak savannas. And if we don't have fire, we don't have oak savannas. And so one of the biggest threats is the loss of their habitat. But another threat is fire. And so we are always trying to balance protecting box turtles, but also making sure that their habitat doesn't disappear, because then they will disappear. So one of my favorite things the DNR does, and I'm hoping to get a volunteer someday to do this locally for Ottawa County Parks, is to train dogs to go and look for box turtles prior to the burns. So they will go out right before a burn, they will find the turtle, they'll put a marker right where they found the turtle, and they'll take it out of the burn unit, and then they'll come back later, and once the burn is done, and put the turtle back in the exact same spot that they found it, since that's its home. So trying to balance restoring these areas and not killing the species that need these restored areas is always a balance. This is one of my favorite species, largely because I've had one coming to my bird feeder, which is pretty incredible. This is a red-headed woodpecker, which is incredibly, very uncommon in Michigan, and largely due to habitat loss. This is one that requires oak savannas. It requires large oak trees with large openings in between. And so even in a suburban area, if you can simulate a savanna, you can have these birds come in, and they readily will come to a bird feeder. They love peanuts and fruit. And it's been really just amazing to watch the one that's come into my yard, because as they fly away, they have this big flash of white. It's just a very graceful, beautiful bird. One of the prettiest birds I've seen at my feeder. Another bird that I couldn't find a photo of to share with you that is in steep decline due to habitat loss are whippoorwills. And some of you might go, oh, I remember the whippoorwills. And that's because whippoorwills used to be more common, but nowadays, in the last 45 years, they have declined 65%. And it is harder and harder to find that beautiful whippoorwill song in the evening and at night. And that's largely because of the loss of its habitat, these oak savannas. Now, they were able to adapt somewhat to pine plantations, but I was always curious, because our pine plantations in Ottawa County and many places around southern Michigan are dying because of climate change. These hot, dry summers are leading to red pines and other more northern species to decline. They're becoming vulnerable to insects and other pests. And so as we've had to remove these, a lot of people are upset because they've had whippoorwills in those pine plantations and they know how rare they are. Well, so when we first started taking these down, I started doing research, and it turns out because pine plantations in the South are not native. So I was wondering, what is their native habitat? What was there before pine plantations? And it turns out it was the oak savannas. They're oak savannas that we've lost were the habitat that they require. These two quotes, both of these actually come out of a Michigan botanist. Many of you hopefully might know the Michigan botanist. It's a great journal that's put out. And in the 2008, I think it was volume 42, they had a whole article about oak savannas, and it was done by two botanists from Michigan Natural Features Inventory. And if you want to know more about oak savannas, that is just a wealth of information. It is where much of my foundation of oak savanna work has come from. And so this first one, again, is by Ruth Hoppen, the one from earlier. And again, just I was reading this again earlier today, and it just brought a tear to my eye because it really happened. And this is the reason why we do what we do. So Ruth, back in 1893, said, "I see the day coming when there will not be a patch of forest where the child may see the flowers which charmed his parents' eye. Like buffalo, the deer, the wild pigeon, aka passenger pigeon, the whippoorwill, and the prairie hen, these two will soon be the things of the past. The last pioneer will soon be gone, and with him, many of the native plants and animals will soon disappear." And it came true. We did have bison that lived, the buffalo lived in Michigan in these oak savannas. And we had many of these oak savannas with these wildflowers that are now lost. Some are completely lost. They're extirpated. They're completely gone from the state of Michigan. Many of them are now rare or the species of greatest concern, threatened, endangered. And of course, the insects that depend upon those plant species are also gone. Right now, the reason why I am desperately passionate about oak savannas is because we worry about wetlands, because so many of our wetlands have disappeared. We worry about these different forests because of logging. What we should be worrying about is the fact that we have 0.1% of our oak savannas left from what we had pre-settlement. 99.9% of our oak savannas have been destroyed. And this is an incredibly important community that has many wonderful wildlife, like the buffalo and the prairie hen and the whippoorwills that were dependent upon it. And the strange part about this is the fact that it's actually many things that have led to the destruction. Part of it was the development going into farms, logging things, logging properties, then properties going into agriculture. But today, one of the single greatest threats to oak savannas is actually overgrowth of trees and becoming an oak forest. So this next quote really hit home to me because when I wanted to restore one of our parks that has remnant oak savanna species in it, I was told by one of our staff members, we don't do that. Our job is not to take trees down, we protect forest. Because to people nowadays, that is what we do. We protect forest is considered a healthy ecosystem, not realizing that 170 years ago, the oak savannas with all the wonderful wildflowers were an important community and a big part of what we were in Southern Michigan. So this quote really captures that. Ironically, a preservationist mentality in Michigan's conservation community has perpetuated the negative impact of European settlement on savanna and prairie. One of The biggest reason why oak savannas have disappeared is because prior to European settlement, Native Americans would annually burn these areas to keep them free of vegetation. It would help them with their hunting. It helped them to be able to see prey and other predators. It was a really important part of their survival. And when we removed Native Americans from the landscape, we actually led to the destruction of this ecosystem because of the succession going into an oak forest. Now, today, another large threat to these oak savannas, even in the areas where we might have some remnants, another great threat are our invasive species. So at Ottawa County Parks, we had a property that was a red pine plantation. We removed it, we harvested it because it was a crop. And once that was removed, the honeysuckle that had just been suppressed was able to flourish. And suddenly, what had been suppressing the wildflowers before, which were the pine trees, were gone, but a new plant came in to suppress these native wildflowers. And by suppress, the largest contributing factor is the lack of sunlight. These are shade intolerant species. Most of them require full sun, but a minimum of partial sun. And so when you have the canopy of whether it be pine plantation, oak forest, or invasive species, they are not able to survive and thrive. Now, let's say you want to go out and do an oak savanna. You want to bring back and make it so that it's 99.2, or that we were at 0.2% of the previous in our state. Well, the best thing to do is to just go out, and if you live in an area in the southern Michigan, especially if it has sandy, dry soils or sandy mesic soils, but not very fertile, those areas that gardeners say, oh, that's terrible soil. Those are the areas that you want to go look and scour and see if you can find some clues that maybe, just maybe, it used to be a savanna. One of our parks, we recently acquired Stearns Creek. We were able to find prickly pear cactus all over in one section. And even though it had been planted as a Christmas tree plantation, it had been farmed, these prickly pear cactus were able to eke out an existence for hundreds of years, despite the way we were managing the land for our own means. And now we're able to restore it and bring it back to its original, hopefully, ecosystem of a savanna. Another great indicator of a savanna, especially if you're in a forested area, there's a lot in Lansing area, but definitely a lot over here in West Michigan, is the flowering spurge, this beautiful white flower. I often like to plant this because I feel like it looks like baby's breath almost. We put this in our wedding areas because it just has that very soft, light look to it. So you could see this is at one of our spots at Connor Bayou. And even though this was an oak forest, there was a little speckling of sunlight that made it down to the forest floor. And this flowering spurge was able to eke out an existence. And you may notice down in the bottom of the picture, something many of you might be familiar with, and that is our butterfly weed. And this is often what will happen in these oak savannas, is that they will have eked out, sometimes for hundreds of years, but they're not flowering, or they might just be roots and rhizomes and they're in the ground waiting for the sunlight to come, waiting for a fire to come and restart them. One of the things that is very fun is finding these new species and wondering, what in the world is this and how did it get here? Again, in a forested area at Connor Park, we had this really unique trefoil. This is called round leafed trefoil. It is in the legume family. And this is not something you can buy commercially. You can't go to a nursery and buy this. You can't even buy seed for this. And so if you have this prairie species that you know what is a prairie species and you can't buy it, it's a good clue that you might have a remnant on your property. Again, another one of my favorite things to do is finding these really cool clues. It's like playing a scavenger hunt on your property. One of my favorite stories is at our Robinson Forest, which most people considered a wasteland after we removed all of the red pines. It was taken over by honeysuckle, if you remember, and then also spotted knapweed. And so we had school groups come into this wasteland and start helping us remove the invasives. Never with the expectation that anything special was going to happen. We just needed a place to put 50 kids. And this was a place that 50 kids could go and not disturb. Well, it turned out that 50 kids simulated bison because this group of students actually came in, removed spotted knapweed, trampled the area just like a herd of bison. And the next year where they worked, this species came up. This is bastard pennyroyal, has one of the best names ever. It's also a species of special concern and quite lovely. And it was there because of the disturbance of the students coming in and disturbing that soil and disturbing that area, and it was able to thrive because many of these prairie species need disturbance in order to grow and survive. You don't always have to have plants to be the indicator. Sometimes it might be structures. Oftentimes when you come into a property and you see these very old white pine stumps, these were oak pine savannas that actually they ripped out the roots of the pine trees and then used them as fencing for their cattle or other things. So there are many different clues in an area. And oftentimes what I have found is that these are the areas that people consider wastelands because they aren't these fertile soils that you can go grow crops. They're often low nutrients and sandy. And so people don't see the value in them. But what's really the value are those species that depend on that system. Now, the next part I'm going to talk about is what it takes to restore. And this slide right here gives a little bit of a clue. Restoring is not pretty. Oftentimes when we talk about restoring, you might think of tractors and digging earth and moving earth. And there are some restorations like that. Some restorations might just take removing the invasive and the native ecosystem is able to thrive. Oftentimes in our oak savannas, it is much more drastic and it's not pretty the first couple of years. And oftentimes it does make people unhappy because unfortunately, a lot of people think short term. And what happens is a lot of times you're going in and you're removing these pine plantations. Most of these pine plantations like these, you can see are already in decline. You know that they're in decline because less than a third of the tree is with needles. It needs to have at least a third of the tree with needles. Otherwise, it's not able to photosynthesize enough for that tree. So we already know this is in decline. We already know it's in decline because it has the native trees are growing up underneath, which means that the pines are not out competing those native trees underneath there. And also we know it's in decline because this particular stand had diplodia. So those trees were stressed out and already need to be removed. But unfortunately, too often when people see that you're in there with logging trucks, they assume that you're just doing it for money and not for restoration. So this is a really big, important lesson for us to spread the word that removing pine plantations is not always just for money. Oftentimes these days, it is to remove a hazard because of the dying trees, or to restore the area to what it used to be, this oak savanna. Sorry, it just started a downpour here. I don't know if you can hear that, but the storm is a-coming. Again, it's really important if you're doing this on your own property to expect it's not going to be pretty the first couple of years. And also if you're on a public land or doing this as an example site, to prepare the people that are going to come and see this, to understand that it may look terrible at the moment, but the long term, you're restoring something that is part of our natural heritage here in Michigan. And I also want to stress in this particular example, you can see many of the trees we removed, even though people didn't notice, were already dead. We had a lot of old Christmas trees at this site. So again, Christmas tree plantations often were oak savannas. And then we also had a lot of spruce trees, and they had succumbed to disease. And so even though they were seeing trees, they were not alive. So removing them, again, provided more sunlight to reach the soil. And then, of course, because these are fire dependent systems, it is important to put fire into the system. It is not required. There are people who live in areas that cannot have fire, but these are fire dependent systems. The plants that are there are adapted to the heat and the smoke of a prescribed fire. And so when the fire does a couple things. One, it releases the nutrients that are in the dead material into the soil. So it infuses nutrients into the soil for the young seeds or seedlings that might be in there. It also, the heat and the smoke both stimulate seed germination. And so there's a lot of different studies out there showing that if you really want to have a healthy, vibrant, reproducing savanna, fire is critical. Having said that, and again, mowing can simulate it somewhat, but it's not the same. The fire also, an important component, is setting back young trees and young shrubs and saplings. And so again, the first year, you can see this area was burned. It doesn't look pretty. You have a lot of what looks like destruction, but in fact, it's regeneration. I always like to think of the phoenix, that we often see, that is really the regeneration, the restoration. It's scary, but it's in this particular situation with controlled fire and prescribed fire, it is contained, it's safe. If you use people that are trained in this, they have the proper equipment. It has a prescription, just like a drug has a prescription, and you only do it on days that have certain weather, including wind speed and humidity. And it's not just to prevent a wildfire, but it's also to create the effects that you want. You can't go out and burn a prairie, an oak savanna, when it's humid out or when it's cold. You have to have the right conditions, the right prescription that will give you the effects that you want. This particular burn was perfect. We killed off almost the entire understory of trees, and what was left were the large trees that are adapted to fire, things like bur oak, pin oak, things that are adapted to fire that were able to survive and thrive. And they're going to get bigger, where the littler trees will die off, and then they will stop shading out those younger or the smaller herbaceous plants. One of the fascinating things I actually just learned in putting this presentation together that I did not know is that when the pioneers came, one of the first things that happened was what is called grubbing. So you may have seen this. And so again, the Native Americans would annually burn these areas to regenerate that soil and to put those nutrients back in and keep it open. But what immediately happened was this flush of wildflowers once those fires were stopped, and the grubbing, where the trees actually, you can see that the top was killed off, but then the bottom just kind of has many little stems coming out of it. And it turns out that these are trees that have decent roots. And so when they came back and there was no fire, these are the ones that oftentimes were able to jumpstart over top of a seedling that was just coming out of a seed, like an acorn nut, and were able to become those big, beautiful, open oak trees that we know about, and like the first slide. So these grubbing is an important part of an oak savanna because it allows these trees that have been burned to come back stronger. And again, speaking to the phoenix, one of my favorite things to do is after a fire goes through is to see how quickly the native vegetation comes back that's adapted to fire. And within a few weeks of one of our fires, you can still see the charred soil underneath these plants. Within a few weeks, these low bush blueberries came back stronger than before. And you can see their beautiful white bell flowers only a few weeks after. So these had been burned, they had been charred, and they came back stronger and healthier and had the best blueberries. They were so good. And it's really exciting because today we now can go to some of these places. They're not like the places of Chicago yet. This is one that, is at Robinson Forest. It has been burned twice. We're going to do the third burn this year. We're not at that 60% canopy yet. We're getting close, but we're still above that 60%. And it's going to take repeated burns to knock back the smaller ones and allow the larger ones to grow and thrive. But the very exciting part about this is that there's always a surprise. So for years at this particular spot, we had been watching, and along the trail where there had been a homestead and it had been kept open, there was butterfly weed and fragrant sumac and all these different species that are indicators, like that bastard pennyroyal, that were all indicators of an oak savanna. But if you went into the area where the pine plantation had been, it really wasn't very diverse. It was pretty sad, actually. And for a couple of years after the first burn, I thought this was a failure. And one of the things that nature has taught me is that you need to be patient. And for anyone who has maybe planted a prairie or planted a native landscape, you know that sometimes it just takes time. It takes a couple of years for the seed to germinate. Sometimes it takes 5 years for something to pop up out of your garden. So this is my garden, Robinson Forest. And every year I go and new species pop up after the burn. New species have germinated, and there are all these different prairie species. Some of them I have to look up each year because I've never seen it before, a brand new plant that I've never seen in my life. Very exciting, just came from the soil and it's been waiting there for a minimum 50 to 100 years because the pine plantation there was at least 80 years old. And so those seeds have been just waiting there for the day that the sun would come back out and the nutrients and the fire would be there. And I have been waiting and waiting, hoping and wondering when the next plant would come. And this year, for the first time ever, we had lupin pop up out of the burn unit. So it was probably one of the best days of 2021 to walk along the trail in an area that had been a red pine plantation, just with, inches of needle duff, that now has pen sedge and beautiful wild lupin and so many other new prairie species that had just been waiting for somebody to come and restore them. I have one other topic I want to talk about that Sue asked me to talk about in a second. But I did want to ask if there are any questions. Linda, we have prickly pear cactus. I will say, Linda mentioned prickly pear cactus at Hemlock Crossing. Prickly pear cactus is one, especially in Ottawa County, that we can't use as an indicator because it was so commonly planted. Somebody must have been a Johnny Appleseed with prickly pear and put it all over the dunes and many other places because it likes that sandy, dry, nutrient poor soil. So we do have it at Hemlock. I think that might have been a remnant, but also it could have been planted. But it's really the indicators are the things that you can't buy anywhere. You know, you can't buy it from a nursery or for stock, and or are things that people wouldn't want to grow. So things like grasses, like poverty grass, or things that might not be as showy, but are good indicators. One of my favorite is the lichen British soldiers. That's a really cool lichen. We can't grow that, right? That's not something we can grow in a nursery. And yet is a good indicator of those nutrient poor soils.
I don't see any questions in the Q&A, but if you have one as we move along, please put those in there and we'll address them at the end.
All right. So I just have one last slide. And Sue wanted me to put this in there because it is almost April 15th. It is critical, absolutely critical, no matter where you are in the state, to stop cutting your oak trees. This is the time and year in which we are vulnerable to oak wilt. And it is, if you have not experienced oak wilt, I hope that you never do, because it is a truly terrible thing to have to manage for. This is one of our parks called North Ottawa Dunes. And at this particular park, it's south, just adjacent to Hoffmaster Park. And Hoffmaster Park had been managing oak wilt for a couple years and had it contained. And we went in and contained them, and everything was good for a couple years. And then one of the neighbors went and had their oak trees trimmed in the wrong time of the year. And you can, if you trim after April 15th, you can immediately put on some kind of sealant on it to make sure that the picnic beetle, which is the insect that spreads the fungus that kills the tree, you can prevent that by painting any cut surfaces. Unfortunately, too often people don't know that, and they cut their branches, and picnic beetles can come from miles. And they will come to your tree, they land on that sap as they feed on it, and they have the spores of the fungus on their feet, and it will go into the tree, and then it has infected the tree. So the problem with this is not only is it killing that tree, but oak trees are actually all connected underneath the soil through their roots, through their rhizomes. So they have these, their roots are grafted together. So one tree is directly connected to another tree. So many of you have probably been reading these amazing books about how trees communicate. They can oftentimes, they can help support each other. A parent tree can help support their saplings by sharing sugar to help them grow. They often do a warning from one tree to the next if there's an invasive or a problem. So there's amazing research coming out about how important these underground communication systems are by these grafted roots. Unfortunately, it also means, just like a computer virus, right? If one tree is infected, it then can go throughout that network and infect every other tree that's connected to that root system. To understand the severity of this, we want the tree that we have here on the north side was a very, very large red oak, absolutely stunning and beautiful. one tree, because of the formula to figure out how far you have to treat to stop the spread of the oak wilt, we had to kill a half of an acre of oak trees to stop the spread of the fungus. So when it's not the one tree that's died, it can be a half of an acre or more. The house on the south, they had one tree that had a branch over their fence, and they didn't want the branch. They knew that the oak trees were dying in their neighborhood, and they didn't want it to die and destroy their fence. So they cut the branch off of our oak tree to prevent it from falling on their fence, and ended up killing that tree, which was a minimum of 150 to 200 years old. And then we ended up having to kill about a half an acre to prevent that from spreading. And unfortunately, because it's always in the environment now, because the neighborhood is invested in so many places around, that we now really have no solution at this point for North Ottawa dunes, because it has a lot of critical dune. And every time there's a windstorm and there is a branch on an oak tree that breaks, the picnic beetles can come in from miles and it's infested. And so it's kind of like whack-a-mole at this point in this particular park, because even though nobody's cutting branches within the park, just wind breakage and having it in neighborhoods adjacent is enough that we have at least a couple of trees every year become infested. And what that means is not only, it's not like a neighborhood tree that obviously is sad when you lose, a beautiful 100, 200-year-old tree. We're losing habitat, and we're also losing the thing that is stabilizing our dunes, stabilizing that sand. And if we lose those oak trees, we really have risk destabilizing our dune systems. So this is something that's very important, and is really important that we all know. It's almost April 15th, and a lot of companies here in West Michigan, they will not touch your trees. But that doesn't mean you might not go touch your tree. And or if you're not in West Michigan, I don't know if they are as educated. So it's very critical that you educate yourself, you educate your neighbors, and so that you can prevent having the same problem of having to lose all your beautiful trees. Now, having said that, it does mostly affect red oaks, so red oak, black oak, pin oaks. The white oak group is not as affected. It does not have the same mortality rate. Okay. With that, are there any questions?
I don't see any.
It's so thorough.
Melanie, if our viewers would like to get more information on oak wilt, where would you suggest they Google?
We are so fortunate. I always Google Michigan Oak Wilt Coalition. So it is a coalition of the DNR, of many of the tree services, and others, and it has a plethora of information, including it will tell you when it's time to stop trimming your trees. And it has places that you can contact to help you if you need the trenching, because in the dunes, we had to actually kill trees to stop the spread. In your own yard, you might be able to just trench down into the soil to sever that root system, those grafted roots. Oftentimes, those roots will regrow. So the trenching is just a short-term fix. You'll have to come back in and retrench again, potentially in the future. So, but yes, so Google Michigan Oak Wilt Coalition.
And then what's the date in the fall where they consider it safe to do some trimming?
Oh, that is a great question. I don't know off the top of my head. I believe it's September. But check out that website. And the problem with it is, these are very general dates.
Yeah.
It's really the flight of the picnic beetle. And so, on that website, sometimes they will change it, but, and oftentimes the companies will be much more conservative, because one of the issues is there are lawsuits out there now of, with people losing $1,000 trees or having to pay to have, all of their oak trees removed, $50,000 of trees removed because somebody came in and trimmed their trees or their neighbor trimmed their trees. And so it's really a liability at this point. But so a lot of the tree companies are very conservative in their time. But it's this year, we have April 15th. The picnic beetles are probably not out right now. It's probably too cold, but it's safe and it's conservative. So I say that because in the fall, that date might not be viable if we have a particularly warm fall. It might be that the picnic beetles are still flying, even into this, November, if we have a particularly warm fall.
Linda Anderson just shared DNR states April 15th to July 15th. And personally, I would wait until November 15th. And that's what I'm thinking. We've had such warm falls. We know that there's still bugs out, in October.
Yes, exactly. And that's why those companies, and I have heard that the DNR says July 15th, but I think the Oak Wilt Coalition does not say that, but I could be wrong. I think they're more conservative than that.
Yeah, I think their date's September too, which seems early to me too, because it's still quite warm.
Right. We've had climate change. I mean, you have to prepare for non-normal weather at this point.
When many of us are still mowing around Thanksgiving, if it's warm enough to grow grass, the bugs are still active in my mind anyway.
Well, and that's exactly it. If you think like they're starting as April 15th, think about what insects are out right now, and so think about what insects are in the fall, so.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments, anyone? I'm looking down here. I don't see any.
I'll probably stop my share. Sorry.
Melanie, thank you so much. That was really interesting. I really enjoyed that.
I hope some people will do this and take it and, put some of these plants in your yard or help your local organization, because how often in your life can you really literally get your hands dirty in protecting endangered species and threatened species in your own backyard and make the place beautiful? That's the best. It's a win-win, right?
I agree. So a couple of quick little housekeeping things. I hope everyone can join us next Wednesday at 7 p.m. We're having Dr. Dave Warners from Calvin University. Yeah, I knew you'd be happy about that, Melanie.
I am. I love
He is
it.
presenting on the Kenosha, their watershed, working for reconciliation in West Michigan watershed. And then he's also going to talk about curb cut gardening, which is a form of rain gardens, which helps slow down the storm water that's going into our rivers, and it helps clean that water up before it hits our rivers and tributaries and our watersheds. So I hope you can all join us for that. One other little note, I sent out a newsletter that had links to our last two presentations, and I got a very beneficial email from one of our members informing me that when he clicked on Heidi's presentation on new and exciting plants, it said that the webinar is not available. That's a big technical issue for Sue, and just know I'm working on it. It's not set to not show, so I'll keep working on it. It's set up like the rest of them, so I don't know why you can't access that, but hopefully that will be fixed soon. And with that, I think we'll say good night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, Melanie. Thank you again.
Happy gardening.
Yes.
Bye.
Thank you, Melanie.